So we will go ahead and begin today's web event. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And thank you all so much for showing up and coming to today's web event. This is the Housing Counseling Basics Series, Financial Management and HUD Grant Administration. My name is William Moore with ICF, and this is brought to you in part by our colleagues over at the Office of Housing Counseling. Before we get started with today's webinar, I would like to provide just a few housekeeping items to keep in mind before we get started. So please note that participants are in listen-only mode. So no need to worry about wanting to mute yourself. You are in listen-only mode. You will only be able to hear the panelists and the presenters for today's webinar. The chat feature will be utilized in order for you to communicate and speak and engage with everyone here. Just simply go to the chat feature and you can type and send your message there. You can submit any questions related to the technology of Zoom. If you have questions related to the technology, please note that one of our colleagues will be in the chat and will be able to help you with any technical issues that you're having. We will also have an opportunity to do a Q&A portion of today's presentation. Please submit any content relevant to the questions in the Q&A box there. You could send it to the host, the presenter, and the panelist. So feel free to just submit any questions, again, related to today's content at any time during today's presentation. The materials for today's webinar have been posted, and the PowerPoint for this session is available for you all. We will provide the link in the chat box for individuals to get access to the PowerPoint related to today's webinar. The webinar materials are also posted on the HUD Exchange in the webinar archive a few weeks after the live presentation. You can easily go and find the webinar based by the date and the topic. And we have on our screen here an example of what that looks like on the HUD Exchange, where you could find the webinar archive. So please take a moment to browse our archive for this webinar and other HUD webinars that we've had in the past. In regards to the webinar certificate, webinar attendees will be marked following the live webinar. Once attendance is marked, you can print a webinar certificate by logging into your HUD Exchange account, or you can go into the learning transcript where you'll be able to see and view your certificate. You can see in the screenshot here where you can easily go to print certificate in order to access it. Be sure to select the course name and again, click on print certificate there. So, while folks are still joining and we have your attention, we do want to do a quick audience quiz. There will be a Mentimeter quiz that we will utilize for today's webinar. Please be sure to go into the link that my colleague has pasted in the chat, and we'll give folks just a few moments to click on that Mentimeter link. Simply click on that link, and then we'll be able to engage in today's quiz that we have for you all. So as you can see here, it looks like that we do have quite a few folks joining. We have quite a number of individuals joining for here. So I'm just going to give just a slight moment for people to hop on here and to join us to take the Mentimeter quiz. If you're joining from your cell phone, you can easily type in 1953-9770. Again, type in 1953-9770. And my colleague has posted that code in the chat. Simply go there, put in that code, and you'll be able to join us here for the Mentimeter. And wow, it looks like we have, we're inching close to about 200 folks that are here. And so that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the Mentimeter quiz. And thank you for those who have joined us. So we have our very first question for you. How much experience do you have with the HUD Housing Counseling Grant? We're going to give folks a few moments to fill this in. So please just take a moment and let us know How much experience do you have with the HUD Housing Counseling Grant? And so far, out of the inching towards, looks like almost 300 folks that we have here joined, we have most people indicating that there's some experience with more to learn. That's good to know. This information that we're gathering here is really going to help us with our conversation that we have with you today, and will help guide the conversation and the content that's being presented. So this is good. It looks like we have a lot of individuals indicating some experience with more to learn. A few folks, it looks like over 100, are saying this is our first grant. So welcome, and thank you all for joining. You'll find the content in this webinar extremely helpful. So thank you for indicating that as well. And we have about 30 plus people that are indicating that they're pros. Great, we always welcome our pros with even more to learn. Any new tips and tricks, great. Okay. And let me confirm, let me make sure here. All right. All right, thank you all for that. Let's see. We have our next question here, just a quick question that we want to ask folks. All right. Okay. All right, so that being said, I'm going to go ahead and go to our next portion here. And again, thank you for those who've completed the Mentimeter. And that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Claire. Claire is going to have a moment to present everyone here, and thank you all so much for providing that feedback. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Claire. Claire, take it away.
Thanks, Will. Glad to be here with you all today. My name is Claire Weatherby, and along with Will, I'm a technical assistance provider with ICF. In the past, I've worked on a variety of nonprofit programs supporting low and middle income homeowners in New York City, and was also a certified housing counselor. I've definitely been in your shoes, sitting down with a grant agreement or a policy document and trying to sort out, how does this apply to my program, and how can I comply and have a successful operation? So really excited to be here with you today to present this information about financial management and HUD grant administration. We have a great team of experts with us today to help unpack this topic. First, we have Jason Savala with Mitigate Inc., who today is acting as a subcontractor to ICF. We have Kim Jakeway with HUD's Office of Housing Counseling in the Office of Oversight and Accountability. Joel Schumacher, also with HUD's Office of Housing Counseling in the Office of Policy and Grant Administration. And then we'll round things out with Courtney Knight, also from the Office of Oversight and Accountability with HUD's Office of Housing Counseling. And so our agenda here today will begin with a welcome from HUD, and then we'll dive right into an overview of the HUD Housing Counseling Grant. We want to give you some basic information, which you may already be aware of, but just to make sure we're all kind of grounding here in the same basics information. We'll go into a little bit about grant administration and key grant agreement terms. Joel Schumacher will take us through some advice around financial management. Courtney will cover the electronic line of credit system, and then we'll review some tools and resources that you can go to find out more, dive deeper into some of these topics, and we will have space for a live Q&A at the end of the session. So again, you can feel free to submit your content-related questions in the Q&A box. We'll answer those in writing throughout, and then we will save some at the end to answer live. With that, I'd like to hand the presentation to Phyllis Ford, Deputy Director of the Office of Oversight and Accountability within HUD's Office of Housing Counseling, to give our HUD welcome.
Hi, everyone. As you just heard, my name is Phyllis Ford, and I am the Deputy Director in the Office of Oversight and Accountability in the Office of Housing Counseling. Our office is responsible for monitoring and oversight of compliance issues. So we're right there with you trying to make sure that everything is as it should be. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to the first in a series of trainings designed for new and seasoned counseling staff. It's been a challenging past 2 years. We've had to make a number of adjustments to meet our counseling missions. We heard from you that this is the type of training that you need now. We need to get back to basics. This series is a training for new counselors and a refresher course for those who are more seasoned. The training series is designed to provide training for newer staff of housing counseling agencies, highlight best practices for housing counseling program compliance, as well as identify some of the common missteps, and equip attendees with the tools and resources to implement the information and advice being shared in the series. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first of the, I got my sheets confused. But what I like to do now is to let you know that as housing counseling agencies grow and new staff join in the field, OHC wishes to provide a grounding in the basics of HUD housing counseling programs. HUD's housing counseling program relies on agencies to deliver high quality counseling to consumers across the country. HUD hopes that housing counseling grants provide much needed financial support to the clients who need housing counseling services. This webinar and the series as a whole aims to support staff and open doors to further collaboration between agencies and their POCs. Now, I am pleased to get back to basics by welcoming my colleague, Kim Jakeway. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Jakeway, the Deputy Division Director in the Office of Oversight and Accountability. The Office of Housing Counseling is proud to present and welcome you to the Housing Basics webinar series. This three-part webinar series, starting with today's financial management and grant administration session, is a perfect introduction for newer housing counseling staff and a great refresher for our more experienced ones. These webinars will highlight many housing counseling best practices and can help you to avoid some common missteps. Each webinar will provide you with tools and resources you'll be able to use and refer to back to at any time. On February 1st is the record keeping and file maintenance webinar that will cover the required basic day-to-day counseling documentation for compliance, such as the key elements of client files, follow-up actions, the activity log, and record retention. Then on February 15th, we will round out the webinar series with our tips and tricks for using CMS and HCS. This webinar will emphasize the important role your client management system and your housing counseling system will play with your daily housing counseling operation, including client-level data input, HCS profile updates, and 9902 reporting requirements. To start off today's session, I'm going to give a quick overview of HUD's housing counseling grants. OHC provides housing counseling grant opportunities that offer federal financial support to HUD-approved housing counseling agencies in their work to address consumer housing and financial needs. These grant funds can be used to leverage external resources and funding to increase the sustainability and quality of housing counseling services and programs, support counselor training needs, and provide greater access to housing counseling, including those in rural areas and for traditionally underserved populations. We awarded our first housing counseling grants back in 2013, and as of 2022, we have awarded over $490 million in housing counseling grant funds to housing counseling agencies nationwide. Additionally, beginning with the 2021 NOFO, we launched the Partnering with Minority Serving Institutions initiative to fund partnerships between housing counseling agencies and historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, universities, and other minority serving institutions. If you're interested in learning more about any of these upcoming housing counseling NOFO grant opportunities, or about the Partnering with the Minority Serving Institutions initiatives, please refer to our resource link at the end of today's presentation. And with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Jason.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to join HUD and ICF for this informative webinar series. I instruct on national professional certification courses that are aligned to the HUD housing counseling compliance and support monitoring and technical assistance for intermediary oversight. So let's dig into the highlights of grant administration. There are 3 key steps of grant administration we focus on with this graphic: funding, activities, and closeout. Funding starts with the notice of funding opportunity. This is about your anticipating the announcement to be able to respond and identify the project description and eligibility. Once the NOFO has been received, it's going to be time for planning and applying. Remember, adequate timing is key to make the best effort to represent your capability and your needs. After the application is going to come the receipt of the award. The next key step is linked to receiving your award are the administration activities. This includes agreement execution. Please read your agreement thoroughly. Even common concepts that you've seen before can be subject to changing conditions. Here you accept the award, reconfirm your budget and projections, then through your production following the funding drawdowns, which must be timely, reasonable, and accurate, and accompanied with activity reports. This supports the part of the agreement requirements. And then the last key step is your closeout. This includes the final report, including your summary activity, narrative from the grant period. And remember that file retention is required to be able to respond to oversight lookbacks. So if someone needs to review 2019 or 2020, for example. Now let's look at some of those key grant agreement terms. We start with the period of performance. This is the set timeline by which you are representing your housing counseling activities tied to the HUD grant. Only costs outlined as eligible can satisfy reimbursement. These are most commonly your program labor and benefits, training and marketing, and some other aligned cost codes. Look at your agreement for a broader list, and note that while there is an ability to request for reimbursements and/or extensions outside of the period of performance, just remember to seek permissible use in advance, not forgiveness after the fact. The next terms are projected services and budget. These are tied to successful production and responses expenses. So the first focus here is to recognize that HUD offers direct grant agreement execution training. Talk to your HUD POC for guidance if you need any additional support. Your work plan affirms your service offerings and how you mechanize them. It's critically important to revisit your work plan periodically, particularly if you have recently or if you're considering altering your services since your application. And if you are impacting your project budget, make sure that HUD has approved it. Lastly, if you have changes to your program staff and not just your certified counselors, you must notify HUD. Now to wrap up the grant administration section, The next level of grant agreement terms includes the prohibition of subcontracting. You may not subcontract your counseling services, but third-party education could be fine. A highlight of this allowance is that they still need to cover key content, so avoid partial content delivery providers. The next term is conflicts of interest. Look to the HUD handbook requirement for a full detail of expectations. This will include both perceived and real issues, and make sure you have developed a suitable disclosure statement for your clients that support non-obligation clauses for obtaining your services. For audit considerations, your program must comply with the single audit, the 2 CFR Part 200, and assorted supplementals. They are narrowly mentioned here, but represent a substantive layer of oversight, access, documentation, and support. Follow the links to make sure you're operating in accordance with your agreement. Presumably inherent to your program's existence is your adherence to non-discrimination policies and practices. It's not just a feel-good, but a series of broad compliance requirements with federal laws. And the last key terms are tied to record keeping and client files. This focuses on retention, security, access, both internal and for monitoring and more, and are also represented in the 2 CFR Part 200 and the 24 CFR 214. I'm pleased to offer that HUD will provide a deeper dive into these expectations through the basic series. So follow the links here as well in order to be able to sign up for more details. So now let's wrap up this grant administration section. We're going to look at HCSs and CMSs, the HCS and CMSs. You must have an approved client management system that connects your data points, intake, and processing interfaces to be able to connect with the HUD housing counseling system. That manages your reported program data. Note that a list of approved CMSs is available on the HUD Exchange. A critical use of your CMS is capturing funding sources for your activities. Failure to capture this is like having a random or no receipts after eating at a restaurant. You need to be able to show who paid for what services, for HUD, for your clients, and others alike. All of this information received by the HCS from the CMS helps to populate the HUD 9902 report that reflects your periodic activities. And it supports the projected activities that you populate at the beginning of your fiscal year. Again, click the basic series link for more details on 9902 guidance. So that's it. Claire, is there time for some Mentimeter questions?
I think there is. Thank you, Jason. We are going to return to Mentimeter, so you can use the same code that you used at the start or click the link in the chat. And so we will just back up to question number 1. And I see that a lot of folks are in there right now. So I think we can start the timer. The way this will work is you will have about 25 seconds to answer, and we are going to cover some of the content that Jason just talked about. So we hope that you were listening closely. Will, do you want to hit enter to start the quiz? Great. Our first question is, an HCA wants to subcontract web-based group education services, but they're worried about violating the rule against subcontracting from the grant agreement. Can they proceed? So your options are, yes, the grant allows subcontracted web-based group education only, or no, the grant agreement bars all subcontracting. So what do you all think? Waiting for your answers. And yes, it looks like most of you got it right. So under the grant agreement, you can subcontract, but only for those web-based group education services. And of course, they should also comply with the other HUD requirements for what that education looks like. Okay, let's move to the next question. And I think we can jump in. So your question is, an agency lost one HUD certified counselor and they hired another within the same month. Do they need to notify anybody? And your options are that yes, they would notify their HUD point of contact within 15 days and validate an FHA connection, or no, do they not need to notify anybody because the number of counselors has not actually changed? So what would be the answer here? And it looks like, yes, you picked up on this. All of you, almost all of you have answered that if your HUD certified counseling staff changes, you'll need to make those updates in FHA Connection. And when we get to the tools and resources section of the presentation, I will show you where there's a link with some guidance for those of you who are application coordinators in FHA Connection to get more information about how to make those updates. And so let's go to our final question for this round. Let's see, the question is, as grant manager, Tanya keeps copies of reimbursement requests submitted to HUD, not the underlying documentation of program expenses. Is this okay? So Tanya is not keeping the underlying documentation, she's just submitting the reimbursement requests. Your options are yes, since HUD does not require the documentation to be submitted, she doesn't need to keep it. Or is it no, you must still maintain documentation? And it looks like, yes, 374 of you got the correct answer, which is that you must keep all of the underlying documentation of your program expenses, even though you're not submitting it with your request to HUD. And of course, as you all know, this is also a good practice accounting-wise, financial management-wise. And so we would expect you all to be doing that. So thank you for participating in this rapid fire quiz. And what I will do now is turn it back over to Joel Schumacher, who is going to walk you through some really helpful advice about managing finances under the grant. Joel.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. My name is Joel Schumacher. I'm with HUD's Office of Policy and Grant Administration. I have been involved in all processes of the grant lifecycle in my entire 6 years here in the Office of Housing Counseling. I'm really excited to share this information, especially seeing how many people for whom this is your first grant or you don't have a ton of experience, but also kudos to the 30 plus pros that are on the line for your continued interest in professional development. And I hope I am able to give you some new tips and tricks. So let's begin. One of the first things to keep in mind when reporting, when you submit your grant activity report, is what's going to go on it. Obviously, this is a cost reimbursement grant, so we're going to need to see your costs. And it's important to keep in mind what costs are or are not allowed. So we talk about the eligible expenses. Those can break down into direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are incurred directly for the benefit of your housing counseling program. And also you're allowed to seek reimbursement of indirect costs, things such as your overhead, rent, utilities, etc. That can be done in accordance with a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, should your nonprofit organization already have one. And once you have a NICRA, that's the acronym for negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, it's valid for all federal grants. So once it's negotiated for one grant, you can use it across the federal government. And if you don't have a NICRA, you can always avail yourself of the de minimis rate, which will allow 10% of your direct costs to be recouped as indirect costs. Note that the costs need to tie directly to an eligible activity. So we have them listed here. So a cost needs to be incurred either in pursuit of housing counseling group education, oversight, compliance, and quality control of your program, supervision of your housing counseling staff, training and certification, and marketing and outreach so that the people in your community know of the housing counseling program. I want to note that some costs will not be allowed. Costs that are incurred outside the period of performance are not going to be reimbursed. Obviously, you can't double bill, so costs that are already covered by another funding source, whether it's another grant, passed through from a state organization, or maybe program income you receive. You can't bill twice for the same services, obviously. And any costs that exceed the actual costs will not be allowed. There's no making a profit off of this grant. In order to get the reimbursement, you're going to submit something called a Grant Activity Report, or sometimes we'll call it GAR by its acronym. I want to remind people the burden of proof rests with the grantee. So as we discussed in the Mentimeter quiz that you just passed, you are required to hold on to your source documentation of all the direct costs for which you seek reimbursement. Those could be invoices, receipts, checks, personal activity reports, etc. Your HUD POC with whom you'll be submitting the reports might not necessarily ask to see all those things, but you do have to hold on to them in accordance with the uniform guidance. There's a 3-year retention periods subsequent to closeout. So make sure you do hold on to your source documentation, or you might get a finding or observation during a performance review when HUD comes and inspects your housing counseling program. And we do want people to know that delayed use of your grant funds could result in a default or recapture. So make sure when you do receive a grant award package that you're able to execute it in a timely manner, submit your GARs and drawdowns and vouchers in a timely manner so that you exhaust the funds by the end of the period of performance. What will your GAR contain? This is found in the grant agreement. So keep in mind when you get the grant award package, you're going to get a number of documents with it, of which one of the most important is the grant agreement, because you're going to sign it, HUD signs it, and it's legally binding. It's a contract of sorts. So there will always be a reporting section in it. Currently, it's Article 10. That could shift. Look for the reporting section. It's one of the most important articles in the entire grant. And currently, for those who have received or are applying to receive an FY22 CHC grant, here are some of the elements you're going to have to include. Obviously, your name, address, and grant number, the reporting period for which you're seeking reimbursement, the salaries of your counselors. We're going to need to know the name, title, and because all counseling must be conducted by a HUD certified counselor, we also need to see the FHA Connection certification ID number. If you're seeking reimbursement for, let's say, an executive director doing oversight or supervision, or an administrative specialist who's conducting intake and they're not certified, obviously we're not going to need that, and you'll just note under their activities and we'll be able to see that they're not engaged in counseling. You'll have to include the hourly rate. Make sure you do a breakdown of the salaries versus the fringe portion. Once you have the salaries, that'll be multiplied by the number of hours for each employee. And that's not all. Any itemized expenses. So in addition to the salaries and fringe, for instance, maybe you sponsored a new employee to go to a training to learn about housing counseling and become certified. Maybe the cost of the certification exam itself. Maybe travel, if you provide housing counseling services on the go to homebound clients, or maybe the counselor that you sent to go receive training had travel and per diem expenses. So you're allowed to itemize expenses. Note, we really do not like to see the words other or miscellaneous or administrative because we don't know what that is. So if you are itemizing expenses, you will need to provide a description with sufficient clarity that your HUD point of contact can make it out. And if not, as I said before, burden of proof is on the grantee to know what that cost is. So we're going to hold your feet to the fire in that regard if we're not content that the cost does in fact align with an eligible activity. So err on the side of specificity when submitting a grant activity report. If you're using a fixed fee methodology, and it's very rare, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, you will need to have your GAR specify the activities done in accordance with the per unit costs. You'll have to update the 9902 data in HCS. In fact, 9902 reporting, and I'm not going to go into detail, that's another topic. But if you're a HUD approved housing counseling agency, you know what 9902 reporting is, that it's done quarterly. That is a precondition to submitting a GAR. So you won't be submitting a grant activity report until we already have the 9902 data in HCS. There are additional items in your GAR if you made specific commitments in your grant application. For instance, there was a fixed amount bonus given out for counselors that were engaged in mortgage default counseling. So there's additional reporting requirements there if applicable. And now we're going to take a moment to actually look at a sample grant activity report. So it's not required to use this form. That being said, you might find it helpful. And the link is provided. If you go to the link that was sent out earlier, you'll see at the bottom of the page that this was attached as a file you can download and use at your own volition. So in this sample, you're only going to fill out the fields that are annotated in yellow. And there's 3 tabs. There's a cover sheet, then a tab for staff salaries, and a third one for itemized expenses. So let's start with the first one. You're going to put in your name, address, what grant you're dealing with, and what the period of performance for that grant is. In this case, this GAR template is designed specifically for FY22. So you can see that the period of performance is fixed and the quarters are annotated as appropriate for the FY22 period of performance. So in this case, we see that Howtown Community Counseling is submitting a grant activity report and that it has covered the first and second quarters of their period of performance. The period of performance is by default 1 year, unless you have an approved extension, and as such, quarters 5 through 8 are blocked out. But if an extension were to be approved, then you would have additional space to fill in for subsequent quarters. And if you could scroll down quickly, we can see some other aspects. For instance, there's the certification language. This changes every year, and we find that some grantees are running on autopilot and don't necessarily update it. So in this case, this template has been updated with the FY22 certification language per the grant agreement. So then the appropriate official will sign and date this and give their contact information. And then at the bottom, we have just helpful reminders of items that need to be done, that you validated your profile in HCS. That needs to be done quarterly. So remember to validate when you go in there for your 9902 reports, that you have indeed submitted the 9902 report to HCS, and that you've completed the salaries and fringe tab, the itemized expenses tab, and if applicable, the additional final report information. And the final report information isn't a tab here because that entails narratives and other items that you'll find on the grant agreement. But just a helpful reminder that the final report does have additional elements that need to be included. So let's look at the tab for staff salaries and fringe. So up at the top, you'll see that you're going to put the staff name and title of the staff member for whom you're seeking reimbursement, along with what activities they're engaged in, because their activities need to tie to an eligible activity. So in this case, taking a quick skim of the document, we see we have housing counselor Jane Doe, along with James Ray. And then the third staff member is an administrative assistant, Fred Mee. And finally, we have the salaries for the executive director, Sally Fa. So you have the name, title, and activities for each of the staff. Then you're going to put in the FHA certification ID number. In this case, we have 2 housing counselors who definitely need to have it. So we see that those numbers were provided. And then there's a section to the right where the HUD POC will verify it in the system. That's why it's not in yellow. not for you to fill out. It's for your HUD staff to fill out. We see that the administrative assistant doesn't have a housing counseling certification ID number, but they're engaged in intake and preparation of files. And per the certification rule and FAQs on the topic, we know that those are activities that can be undertaken by a staff member that isn't certified. So all in compliance there. And then the executive director is engaged in, it looks like, reports and communication with the grantors. That makes sense. And supervision of the counseling sessions. So those are oversight, compliance, and quality control activities. So we can see they're tied to an eligible cost. And although it's not required to be certified, in this case, Sally is certified. So it shows that she has the knowledge necessary to lead this organization. So then columns D and E are where you'll input the salaries and fringe. Those will auto-calculate. Column G, you'll put the number of hours engaged in each of those activities. And then Excel, being a smart computer that it is, will multiply the hours by the total rate to come up with costs per activity, which will auto sum per staffer. And at the bottom will auto sum completely. And in this case, 2 quarters were included, so you can see additional information for quarter 2. That will auto sum into the third tab. So if we could look quickly at the itemized expenses. We can see that the salaries and fringe were transferred over, and then any additional costs that you need to itemize, travel, training, marketing, credit reports, etc. Those direct costs are all listed there. And additionally, some organizations have shared or joint direct costs. You'll know if that applies to you, in which case a proportional share of those costs will be imputed to the housing counseling program. And you can complete that in lines 11 to 22. That information will auto sum in rows 26 and 27. You can specify if you're seeking reimbursement. There's an option between your NICRA, the de minimis rate, or none at all. And as appropriate, the indirect cost rates will be calculated based upon the total direct costs or modified total direct costs, summing it up at the bottom. So that's an overview of a sample GAR. You don't have to use this one. Many organizations that are repeat grantees already have their own templates, but if you're new to the program, and we saw a lot of people from this is the first grant, then it might be helpful to download this and give it a try. Hope it's helpful. So like I said before, the final report will have additional elements. So in addition to all the standard elements that are in a GAR, you're also going to include a narrative where you describe either problems that prevented you from meeting the objectives of the award, or perhaps favorable developments that enabled you to do more with less as appropriate. Additionally, if you're having difficulty or delays with grant closeout, maybe you're unable to expend your funds, we're going to need an explanation of why you weren't able to. There's an additional certification. In addition to the one with each of the GARs that you saw in the template, there's an additional certification that you'll need to sign, which states that you've engaged in the closeout activities per the uniform guidance. Additionally, while you executed your grant, potentially with a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, those were provisional rates. And at the time of grant closeout, the final report should have NICRAs, because you update your NICRAs on an annual basis, submitting it to your cognizant agency. And there's separate trainings on indirect cost rates if people have questions on that. But during the final report, you'll need your NICRAs that have finalized those previously provisional rates for any time period for which you sought reimbursement for direct costs in accordance with your NICRA. There's the SF 425 as applicable. And then those grantees which have opted into the MSI initiative in FY21 and FY22 as well, there are additional requirements for that initiative as specified in the grant agreement. Key deadlines And this isn't us just being meanies. This comes from 2 CFR 200, the Uniform Guidance for Grant Administration. A final report is due no later than 120 days following the end of the period of performance. That other deadlines, you have to submit the GAR, the grant activity report, in conjunction with each drawdown request. That's a self-reinforcing deadline. If you don't submit a GAR, you won't get money. So the desire to actually tap into that grant is the stick that we have for submission of the GARs. But sometimes there's also deadlines that are specified in the grant agreement. So always read the grant agreement with each grant award package you receive. Additionally, finally, grantees need to submit reports in accordance with this section within 1 year. So 120 days is what you're supposed to do. But if you exceed 1 year, we are required through OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, to actually submit the grantee's name into their unified system. So you are going to be on Santa's naughty list if you are unable to submit the reports on a timely basis. Again, not our rules. This is uniform across the federal government. So definitely comply with any guidelines and deadlines that are submitted, that are set forth in the grant agreement. So that concludes my section. If you have any questions, be free to put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to hand this back to Jason, who's going to describe some of our best practices.
Thanks, Joel. That was really informative. It's nice to see an Excel that welcomes ease of use. So here are a few supporting best practices. We don't want you to accidentally hold up your reimbursements due to minor clerical errors. So verify the accuracy of your counselor names and ID numbers in the FHA connection. It's simple and easy. Anticipate quarterly deadlines and potential need for systems support by scheduling your reporting responses in advance. Technology and turmoil happens. Deadlines are important. Plan in advance to minimize the perception of irregular oversight. And avoid submissions where your documented expenses cannot be clearly connected to provisions of housing counseling services. Make your reimbursables obvious. As I alluded to on the prior slide, develop simple, consistent practices for expenses you seek to be reimbursed. Here are 3 examples. Always count salary plus fringe, or always count only salary. And or choose a single key staff to seek reimbursement for instead of a percent of a full-time equivalent that might cover many people. And lastly, try to bill for the same service types like just rental or just pre-purchase counseling instead of taking a varied approach. By avoiding complexity, these approaches can save you time and reduce the chance of costly errors. That's it. Claire, how about it? Do we want to do another Mentimeter?
Let's get into Mentimeter. So you'll go right back to the same link that we've been using, or use that code at the top of the screen, 195397770. And these questions are going to cover all of the information that Joel and Jason just shared. So get ready, and I see that folks are logged in. So Will, let's start the countdown. Okay, so Divya wants to expand her housing counseling marketing, but isn't sure whether the HUD grant can reimburse non-counseling expenses. What can she do? So let us know. Should she go ahead and request HUD grant reimbursement, or does she need to find another source of funding to cover that marketing to get those clients in the door? Let us know what you think. You have 1 second. And so yes, many of you got the right answer. Divya can request reimbursement under the HUD grant to cover those marketing expenses. But we also want to note that, as always, the HUD grant is supplementary to be used in conjunction with other funding sources. So if she's able to find a grant that covers those marketing expenses and she can use more of her HUD grant to cover the direct counseling services, that is also always encouraged. Let's move to the next question. And we can jump right in. So again, you'll have about 25 seconds for this. A local housing counseling agency has 3 staff studying for the certification exam. Can the HUD grant reimburse for staff training time and certification exam fees? I know a lot of you are probably onboarding new counselors, or folks are training up and getting ready for that exam. So can you use your grant for staff training time and the exam fee? And the answer is yes, you can use the grant for these purposes. So if you need that support at your agency, you have the grant, you can use it for training time, you can use it for the exam fee. And as always, you'll want to have your budget approved by HUD and make sure that you have all of your administrative and indirect costs in order, but you should be able to use the grant for that purpose. And I believe we have one more question for you here. This is the final quiz question. And the question is, Jared submitted their agency's last drawdown request and a grant activity report. Are they done with HUD grant reporting? So Joel just talked about this a bit. It could either be that, yes, once drawdowns are complete, no more reporting is required. Or maybe you think that actually Jared still must submit his agency's final report. Let us know what you think. Get your answers in. You have 1 second. And yes, you're correct. So 346 people said that Jared still must submit his agency's final report, and that's correct. Now, maybe you already submitted the final report with your last drawdown, in which case maybe you would be done. But we just are trying to emphasize here that you've got to keep in mind that even after you submit your last drawdown, you want to put together that final report that kind of sums up all of your activity, which Joel just described. So thanks everybody for participating in the Mentimeter quiz. Again, I did want to note the responses are anonymous, but we really appreciate you jumping in and putting yourselves out there. So now I will turn it over to Courtney to give us some great and needed information about eLOCCS. Courtney?
Yes, hello everyone. I am Courtney Knight, and I am a housing program specialist with the Office of Housing Counseling, Oversight and Accountability Division. Now, I've been with housing counseling since 2016, and I will say that it is always truly a pleasure to be able to speak with some of the agencies that we work with in our program. I am the team lead for eLOCCS for the Office of Housing Counseling. So today I'm giving you just a brief overview of our system, eLOCCS. Now, eLOCCS is our primary grant disbursement system that we use here at HUD. There are 2 main players in eLOCCS. There's the approving official and there's the user. And both individuals must register for a Secure Systems ID before obtaining eLOCCS access. Secure Systems is the portal that we use to access eLOCCS. So the approving official must be the CEO or executive director of an agency, a board member, a CFO, or a COO. The user must be a subordinate to the approving official. After receiving the Secure System IDs, the 27054E form, which is like our eLOCCS application form, must be completed to obtain eLOCCS access. Now below is a link to our registration guide, and the link is very detailed, and it gives you step-by-step guidance on how to register for the system. To maintain eLOCCS access, the approving official must recertify the user every 90 days. Now, the approving official will receive an auto-generated email from the system, letting them know that it's time to go in and to recertify the user. Users must log into the system every 90 days to remain active. So here's a tip that I like to give my grantees. I like to tell them to just go ahead and bookmark the eLOCCS webpage to their toolbar in their internet browser, and just click on it once a month, maybe even schedule a tickler on your calendar, but just click it once a month to make sure you're staying ahead of the 90 days to remain active. Because if you do not log into the system 90 days, you will be terminated. And once you're terminated, you're going to have to submit that 27054E form and apply again for access. Below is a link to our Getting Started guide. And that is a guide that shows you just how to navigate the system once you've obtained access and how to submit your drawdowns. Claire will enter my HUD email in the chat. So if you all ever need assistance with the eLOCCS system, please feel free to contact me directly. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Courtney. Yes, and I've just put your email in the chat for anybody who does need to reach out about getting assistance with eLOCCS. Now I'm just going to go over some of the tools and resources that have been mentioned here today and a few additional ones for those of you who have further questions about some of the topics we've talked about today or need a little bit more guidance. We've listed these out over a few slides. So you have on the HUD Exchange a number of different resources. First, you have the Housing Counseling Grant Information and Awards page, which describes, which lists prior NOFOs, which are, of course, notices of funding opportunity, which are the notices that the agency responds to in order to apply for funding. And you have a grant award package training for housing counseling NOFO grantees. And as you all may be aware, HUD will offer new grant award package trainings with every grant award. And then we have that special initiatives and partnerships page that Kim mentioned at the top of the presentation, has a little bit more information about that Minority Serving Institutions initiative, which is really exciting. And then we have our HUD 9902 toolkit to assist with your 9902 reporting. And as you've heard mentioned today, we'll have another session in a few weeks that is specifically focused on using your CMS, the housing counseling system, and getting that 9902 reporting correct. We also have some assistance with using FHA Connection. So either if you are a counselor applying for certification, or if you're an application coordinator trying to maintain your organization's information. We have a link to some eLOCCS FAQ guidance along with those links in the slides that Courtney alluded to help you get access to the system, keep your access to the system, and also submit your drawdown requests. And then we also have some guidance from HUD on that topic as well. And then finally, I've got a link here at the top to the Housing Counseling Financial Management Program guidance on the HUD Exchange, as well as a link to FAQs related to financial management. So if you click on that, once you're done with the presentation, that will take you straight to a subset of FAQs that have to do with some of the topics that we've discussed here today. We have your sample grant activity report, which Joel went over earlier in the presentation. Have a bit of information about the housing counseling system, and then a link to the HUD certified CMS products that you can use for your agency if you happen to work for an agency that is still in process, or maybe you're looking to switch CMSs. That's a great link for you there. And we have one more Mentimeter question. It's not a quiz, but I just want to get a little bit of feedback from you. So let's go in there, and again, same link, same code. I see a bunch of you are in there, so we can jump right in. Oh, it is framed as a quiz. So which of these is not a source of guidance on grant administration for the HUD Housing Counseling Grant? So you're choosing the one answer here that isn't correct? Is it your agency's grant agreement, your HUD point of contact, the counseling handbook, the HUD exchange website, or the FHA single family handbook? So let us know which one is not the place where you should go look for guidance. And yes, most of you got this right. This was a gimme. So just wanted to reiterate for you all, if you have questions, if you are wondering where some of the information in this presentation came from, you're always going to go back to that grant agreement. You can always reach out to your HUD point of contact, some of whom presented here today. And then, of course, you can refer to the HUD Housing Counseling Handbook and resources on the HUD Exchange. And if you want to read the FHA Single Family Handbook for other purposes, then we also encourage that, but not for the grant. So let's transition back here to the slides. And I know a lot of you have been putting questions into the Q&A throughout this presentation, and we've been trying to get you answers to those as best we can. So I'd like to invite all of the presenters back on camera. So I think we had Kim, Phyllis, Joel, Jason, Courtney. If you all could come back on, and maybe we can drop the slides for now. And we have a few questions queued up here that I would love to get your take on. So let's see. And there you are, Kim. So maybe we can just start off with some of the ones that came in that have to do with how you are charging your counselor time to the grant and what types of things you can charge. So this may be for you, Joel, but others, please feel free to jump in as well. So we have a question here. Can I charge a client to different grants throughout the same NOFA year? And what do I do with carryover clients from one NOFA year to another?
In terms of billing a client to different grants, I'm conceptualizing that perhaps they came in for one session, then they came in for a different session, in which case the sessions that you're charging to the HUD grant should be specified in the grant activity report included there and in your personal activity report. And then the session, another session billed against another grant, you're just not going to mention in the grant activity report, and the personnel activity reports that we would look at on site would show it billed to a different funding source, whether those are PARs that are on paper or listed in your CMS. And then with respect to carryover clients, the period of performance during which the activity is conducted is the grant that you'll bill it against, unless I'm missing something about that question. So if a client isn't contained within one fiscal year, which is often the case, it takes a while for people to repair their credit score, or maybe they're looking for a house and this crosses over a federal fiscal year, to the extent that the activity was conducted in FY21 versus FY22, you'll bill against that grant as appropriate. And I welcome any further specification or clarification if I missed something.
That's great. Thanks, Joel. I think we have a related question here, which is about billing for intake. And Jason, you may have a take on this as well, but someone has written in that they were under the impression that they could not bill HUD for intake, and they've cited the handbook definition that describes that client intake is not considered housing counseling and wouldn't be reported as a housing counseling activity. So I think they're wondering, okay, so how does this work in the context of the grant?
Sure. So fortunately, Joel provided a very succinct response in the Q&A. I don't know if that went to them directly or open, but the work is billable. The things that you want to see that are reported to satisfy the entirety of counseling should have all of the hallmarks of counseling. So what I think is critically important is, while you may be able to bill singularly for intake, If all you've been doing is doing intake, then you're not meeting your production. And ultimately, if you're being reviewed, you're not hitting all of the proper hallmarks of quality of counseling. So it does have nuance to how they go about doing that. But that's not to say if you were my client, if you came in and we provided intake for you, that is still a billable component.
And if I can add, Jason, too, I actually there's an FAQ that was out on this topic, and I'm thinking that might have in fact been what was cited in the question. So it's FAQ number 3744 from the HUD exchange. And I think what it means when it says it's not reported to HUD under housing counseling is intake alone doesn't constitute a client. They're not going to appear in your 9902 because, like you said, a full counseling has many components. It has intake, it has a financial analysis, it has an action plan, it has closing or follow-up. So the client, just because they're not in the 9902 yet, because they haven't completed the entirety of what constitutes housing counseling, doesn't mean those preliminary steps aren't billable. And this kind of segues with the previous question we had, like what if a client overlaps fiscal years? Well, in this case, they started in August, they did intake. Well, that intake got billed under August for, I don't know, FY21, and then they came back and then they did an additional session in October. Well, now it's the same client, it's in FY22. Now that first session of counseling is billable under 22. So it's billable, even though it doesn't constitute counseling in the full sense, and thus isn't going to be in your 9902 until the entirety of housing counseling is done.
So if I could put a finer point on that, it sounds like what you're saying is that you could bill for the counselor time for the person who did that intake, and then later they'll continue working with the client, and that will later get onto the 9902 once it's a full counseling case. Would that be
Exactly.
an
Exactly. I think the important point, the salient point here is that this is a cost reimbursement grant. So a client isn't the cost. The counselor's salaries that were expending time giving the counseling is the cost. There are different grant types like fixed amount awards wherein you can bill based on milestones or units produced. I think the NeighborWorks stability, I don't know the full name, but that actually reimbursed per client. So that's a different model. So if your organization is familiar with that kind of fee for service, pay per performance model, that might be what you have in mind. But ours is the standard, and it's the default in the federal government to have a cost reimbursement grant, not a per unit production grant. So that's why the salient issue here is it's the counselor time, not the client, that matters.
Great. And we had a couple of people wrote in clarifying that they want to just be sure that you can bill for a client over 2 periods of performance if the service occurs in both of those separate periods.
Yes.
Great. Let's see, what else do we have here in the Q&A? So got a question related to this. So someone has written in and asked, can I charge a HUD counselor to another grant, and then once the HUD services they performed are completed, bill it to HUD? Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
I'll take, I think I responded to that particular question, and I would just caution that it sounds like it may be a doable activity, but it doesn't mean that it's a practicable or recommended design to what's going on, because then it it gets back to those best practices of not doing complicated activities. And so if I have to do a look back 8 months to see about how to redefine things, then I may wind up doing something that I thought might be dual billing, where I'm billing 2 different things for different functions, and I may accidentally migrate into double billing, where I'm charging for something that has already been paid for. So by and large, I'd be inclined to discourage any procedural design for how I look for a different methodology.
Phyllis, I saw you agreeing with that. Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think that it's most important when you're thinking about how you're billing, make it simple. Keep it simple. You need to be able to have an audit trail because we require audits. We do audits if we see a client being billed at one amount at a different grant and again being billed at another grant. We think something's going on there and you have to spend all of that time trying to explain what you actually did. So keep it as simple as you can, nothing that complex. Thank you.
Thanks, Phyllis. Let's see, another question we have here. After submitting the original budget, additional staff is added to the housing counseling team. Can they simply just be added to the budget when reporting expenses, or does the agency need to notify and do an amended budget? So you're adding staff after the budget is approved. Do you need to amend the budget and do you need to notify HUD?
I mean, HUD needs to be notified just because there's a change in the staff. But in terms of the budgets down by how much money is going to which counselor. It tends to be an aggregate. So it wouldn't be something that would require an amended budget.
I think, I'm not sure if this was for anybody else. You were breaking up a little bit, Joel, but I think what you said was that, yes, you would need to notify your point of contact if you have a change in staff and update FHA connection, but you don't need to necessarily change the budget if the overall numbers are staying the same. Is that right?
What I said, and it might have gotten cut off, was in the proposed budget, often there's broad categories because you're trying to predict in advance what you're going to be doing. And it's not always completely aligned and it's not broken down by each counselor. So for instance, I have a grantee. They say, okay, we got $40,000. We anticipate 30,000 will be salaries and fringe, 5,000 will be training, 5,000 will be CMS subscription I'm just making up numbers. That 30,000 is not broken down into counselor Kathy and administrator Annie and executive director Edward. It's just the salaries and fringe. So in that case, there wouldn't be anything to change.
Great. Let's see. So we had a question here about eLOCCS. Courtney, maybe you can help us out. So this person is asking, do we use eLOCCS if we have a subsidiary or they think they should be reimbursed directly through, I'm thinking that this agency is a subsidiary. And so perhaps you could just speak a little bit about who's using eLOCCS and for what purpose.
Yeah, so I saw that question in the chat and I think that Tammy or Kim answered it, I'm not sure, but I want to reiterate what they said. So not everyone at your agency or subsidiary will be granted. And usually if you're under a parent, the parent is
sorry, Courtney, I'm just going to interrupt you for a minute. I think we're getting a lot of feedback. I don't know, perhaps it'd help if you turn your video off.
Okay, how's that? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so yeah, so like I was saying, I'm not sure if you heard everything, but I think is it Tammy or Kim may have answered that in the chat. So I did see that question, and that's actually a great question. So usually, if you're under a parent, your parent is typically handling your reimbursement. So not every sub agency will be granted access to eLOCCS.
Okay, great. Thank you for that help. Let's see, we've got a question here that is, I think, a new question. So someone has asked, can the time spent by an executive director or program manager developing a new program or HUD-related service be billed to HUD on timesheets? So kind of a question about what type of activities by the ED or the program manager can be billed.
And they said developing a new HUD program. What
HUD
kind of
new
program? Is it housing
or-
counseling?
We would hope it's housing counseling, I think, but perhaps you can address both
HUD
scenarios.
does a lot of things.
We're not able to really ask for clarification in real time, so perhaps
Yeah.
you could answer in both scenarios.
I mean, if they're developing a program that has to do with housing counseling, then yes. I mean, executive directors need to direct executively, come up with how they do things, their standard operating procedures, and that's part of the compliance, oversight, quality control. If they're revising their SOPs or their programs, that's what we would expect them to be doing. Again, the element is there needs to be a reasonable nexus between the cost incurred, the salary, the time spent, and an activity. So housing counseling, running the housing counseling program, yes, that's coverable by our grant. It's comprehensive housing counseling, not extremely limited housing counseling.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have a couple of quick hits, I think, here. I don't know if Kim or Phyllis or Jason, you want to jump in on these, but we have, someone is asking whether electronic retention of supporting documents is acceptable, or do they need to keep actual paper copies?
Well, let me jump in on that one because it's easy. Electronic retention of records is absolutely acceptable. With the federal government is actually moving away from paper. So, you know, absolutely. And when we come to do a review, you can give us access to your system. And that way you're not, you know, cutting down more trees than we have to.
Great, good to hear. We're saving space and we're saving trees. Let's see, another quick one. Could traveling to a conference be billed as an expense?
Yes, if the conference is, I'm gonna assume here that it's about housing counseling, or best practices in anything related to housing counseling, maybe how to help renters at risk of an eviction, how to help low to moderate income renters, helping the homeless through communities of care. If it ties to and improves the knowledge of counselors to do their job of providing counseling and education on the relevant topics, which you know from Section 8 and Section 9 of the 9902. If there's a reasonable nexus to housing counseling and the knowledge and training thereof, then yes.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think we're getting the thread here is that for a lot of these questions where folks are kind of unclear, where it's not direct housing counseling service, kind of thinking about, is it related? Is it supporting the delivery of housing counseling services?
Correct. Counselors need to be smart and skilled, and that involves professional education. That's why you can see that training and certification are allowed. So that doesn't necessarily have to be a class that gives you a certificate. When in doubt, though, I do want to remind / caution grantees, you can always confer with your HUD point of contact. If you think you're going to do something like, oh, there's a conference on X, Y, and Z, can I do it? And if the HUD point of contact says yay, then you're covered. And if they don't know, they'll send it up the chain and someone will give you a yes or a no answer on it. So remember the HUD point of contact, the grant agreement, the handbook. There's a lot of sources out there and guidance. But when in doubt, just feel free to ask.
Great, that's a great reminder. Let's see, maybe we can switch gears here a little bit. We have a question of, if an agency has less than $500,000 in revenue during any fiscal year, is an audit conducted by a CPA required? I know this one was answered in the Q&A, but I just wanted to highlight it. I don't know if Jason, you wanted to jump in there, or Joel.
I can do this one again because I actually worked on audit related stuff a couple of years ago. So I wanted to remind everyone first that the uniform guidance subpart F is up to that number. It used to be 500,000, now it's 750,000. So if you receive more than 750,000 in federal grant funds, you are required to have what's called a single scope audit. There will be CPAs involved. They'll know exactly what you're talking about. If you say, oh, I need a single audit or a subpart F audit. If you have less than $750,000, you're not required to have an audit per the uniform guidance. And because you're not required to, then the federal government isn't responsible for reimbursing it. That being said, most organizations will have an independent review of their financial statements conducted on some sort of annual, biannual basis. And we do ask for that in the grant agreement and during grant execution. So we will ask for your single scope, your single audit, subpart F audit, many names for it, if you receive more than 750,000. If you don't, we'll ask for the most recent review of your financial statements by an independent financial analyst. And if you don't have that, we have in-house financial audit analysts who can conduct a review if you find yourself in that case. But by default, we will ask for an audit or independent financial review from everyone. The question is what level it rises to.
Mm-hmm. Great. Hopefully that's helpful for folks who are wondering about that audit requirement. A couple of follow-ups on things that we have already answered. So one is, and how many, so we understand that files can be maintained electronically, and for how long do folks need to retain those records? I don't know if anyone off the top of their head knows, but I think Shauna is also giving us an answer in the Q&A box itself, which is, perhaps I can answer that one. So we have a response here that financial records, supporting documents, statistical records, and anything else should be retained for 3 years from the date the case file was terminated. And so that's just for your standard record keeping. And then if you do have the HUD housing counseling grant, then you should keep those files 3 years from when your final grant invoice is paid.
And let me just add one note to that as well, because we have been doing, we may not do a performance review during that time period. So you need to keep your records up until the time. For an example, if we do a performance review in 3 years, then that period of time is covered. But if you have not had a performance review, you may want to speak out with your POC and say, listen, it's time for me to move these. I want to get rid of these records, but I haven't had a performance review while you're coming out. So, because that's what we look at. We look at the financial records. So bear that in mind too.
Thank you, Phyllis. And let's see, another follow-up here. So we talked about how you can get reimbursed for time spent by your administrators. So executive directors, project program managers. And so the question is, do they need to be HUD certified to request reimbursement? And Joel, if you jump in.
It depends on what they're seeking reimbursement for. So the common eligible activities that executive directors engage in tends to be more your compliance, quality control, and oversight. So that being said, we know that there's a lot of mom and pop, a lot of house counseling agencies aren't huge operations. So if it's the case that someone's dual-hatted, they're an executive director, they do the outreach, they interface with the federal grantors, but occasionally when Counselor Kathy is sick and they need to step in for a session in the afternoon, if they're engaged in housing counseling, then yes, they are required to be HUD certified. If though their main role is interfacing, for instance, I have a grantor, grantee, it's an intermediary. The intermediary itself actually coordinates a lot of programs, but they don't provide any counseling on site. So none of them are certified, and that's not a problem. They can build a grant for coordinating the grant activities, getting the reports, providing training to their network of sub-grantees. So it really ties in terms of the certification. This is less a grant question and more a programmatic question. Do they need to be certified? Well, if they're giving housing counseling, then yes.
Great. Thanks for that distinction. And we do have, there are a lot of resources on the HUD Exchange to do with counselor certification and who needs to be certified to provide which types of activities. If you need more information, you can go there. I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we end, which is to do with, there's a number of questions in here where folks are trying to parse out, how do I handle financial capability counseling, maybe financial coaching? Is this something that can be reimbursed by the grant? And how are you drawing that distinction between financial capability and housing counseling? And I think that this could also be a question that would come up in the 9902, the third basic session, which is housing counseling system 9902 reporting. So it's more of a, less of a grant question, I would say, and more of a kind of a programmatic question along the lines of what you just described, Joel. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in with an answer, but I think what I would say is that, you know, it's got to be those categories that you have on the 9902, those are what are considered housing counseling. So if what you're doing matches that, then you know, you can go ahead and request reimbursement. If it doesn't quite rise to that level, maybe, I know a lot of agencies kind of offer services that are similar to housing counseling, but maybe not meeting all the requirements. That's kind of what you want to pay attention to. Kim, do you want to add to that?
I mention one thing is that we might want to look at your work plan for clarification on that to see exactly what you were talking about, and then we would probably reach out to you to find out what that meant, because we want to make sure the work plan matches what you're putting in your 9902.
And it's important to both of your comments, Claire and Kim, are very true. There are a lot of terms related to budgeting and financing, and there are a lot of activities like even issues where a organization will take your money and pay your bills and things of that nature, which may not, as you say, rise to the level of financial training as such, or counseling as such. So yeah, we would have to take a look at what your work plan is and what the goal is of the activity to determine if it would be considered a counseling activity.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on, which is kind of reinforcing this takeaway that if you have more questions like these, if you're not sure how you should treat stuff, you can reach out to the folks you see here, your HUD points of contact, to get that clarity and get some advice that's tailored to your specific situation. So I just want to thank everybody who presented here today. You have just provided a wealth of information and knowledge and expertise with the audience. So we hope it's been helpful. And I will turn things over to my colleague, Will, to just close us out.
Sure. Thanks, Claire. And again, I echo those sentiments. Thank you to our colleagues at HUD and to our audience for participating in today's webinar and receiving very helpful information that will help you all in your respective communities. Before we end, really quickly, I wanted to just go over a few items here. Please be sure to go to the HUD Exchange Housing Counseling page. Our colleagues are going to put some of those links in the chat, but please note that these links are available in the materials that you all have received. We encourage you, if you have any questions, please email us at housing.counseling@hud.gov for any questions that you may have or any follow-up related to today's webinar. And we also encourage you to please search for the HUD approved housing counseling agencies. That link is also hyperlinked here on this slide. And so please feel free to take advantage of that resource as well. A few quick announcements while we have you all here. Again, we do have several webinars coming up in a series. But excuse me, before I go there, let me first encourage everyone, of course, to visit the training digest on the HUD Exchange that's been mentioned several times throughout this web event. But the upcoming trainings, please note that we have several series coming up. The first one is the continuation of our OHC Basics series. The first webinar that we have, February 1st, coming up really soon, on record keeping and client file maintenance. The next one is coming up February 15th on tips for using your CMS and your HCS. Then in our next batch of series related to energy efficiency essentials series is the benefits and basics of energy efficiency and home energy assessments. That's coming up on January 26th. Then we also have our incentives and resources to make energy efficiency a reality. That's on February 9th. Then finally, in our last set of series here, the Combating Appraisal Bias series, we have on January 31st, the Generational Wealth Gap Roundtable. Again, all of these are located on the Training Digest on the HUD Exchange. You can see the screenshot on the right-hand side of this slide where you can find that information and where you can go in and also register to get ready to attend those trainings and receive, again, very valuable and helpful information to do the great work that you all are already doing in your respective communities. Please take a moment to read this slide in this disclaimer that we have here. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you to all of our panelists. You all did a wonderful job in presenting some very complex but very important content for a lot of our attendees that I'm sure they would appreciate and are appreciative of you all providing for today. So again, thank you for attending, and we will see you all on the next series coming up in our series. Have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, everyone, and thank you so much for attending. Bye-bye for now.